Let's move on to the fifth critical principle of RDI, the need to modify your communication environment. You know, a lot of people get confused between what communication is and what speech is. And these days there's a lot of emphasis in the area of autism in teaching children speech, as if speech itself will somehow rectify autism or make it better. The critical deficit doesn't seem to be speech as much as it is communication, and also thoughtful speech. What people fail to realize is that we can teach someone to speak as a product of what they're thinking about, of thought, or as a behavior independent of thought. Now, I don't know about you, but the last thing I want is to be stuck with someone who speaks without thinking. Why in the world would we actually create an intervention programs that would do that? I don't know. But we want to be careful to make sure that there is thought before speech. Now, when we move to communication, communication requires not just thoughtfulness, but also an agreement between the parties, a consensual agreement, that they want to exchange new information. In other words, communication is derived from the idea that we want greater uncertainty. We want to ask the other person, what's new? Or what do you think about this? Or what are your ideas? Which does open up the possibility or probability that we're going to be introduced to new concepts, things we hadn't thought about. That's what we call communicative intent, the intention to communicate for new ideas and new information. A major problem in our field is that many people in the spectrum, many children, are taught to talk without communicative intent. So they talk and talk and talk, and their words just become obstacles or meaningless or off-putting to other people. We have to make sure that the functions of communication, the intent, the desire, and curiosity precedes teaching people the skills. Another critical part of communication that sometimes we forget in our overemphasis of speech is that time after time researchers have found that over 70% of the meaning we obtain from communication occurs from nonverbal elements. We all know that the way you use your voice, the way you emphasize, the way you pause, the way you gesture, and how you use your face and eyes completely changes how another person will interpret what you are saying. The same message of, oh, I hate your guts, said with a smile and a sort of whimsical gesture, has a great difference in meaning, just the opposite, of course, as someone who is your enemy threatening you with that same group of words. What we do know in development is that children become competent in the nonverbal aspects of communication before we enhance their communication with language. So even before the age of 15 months, when we see an explosion in many children of language development, we are already dealing with a very competent communicator, where language is just a major enhancement and development in an already established communication system. If we develop language without that foundation, once again, we're going to create a deviant style of communicating or speaking, and we're likely to sacrifice the real value of communication. A final thing that's important to understand is that communication doesn't just develop as a way to exchange ideas and feelings with other people. It also, starting with the age of 2, begins to develop as a way of communicating with ourselves. As early as 2, children learn to narrate their own actions, to plan, to reflect on what they're doing. All of these are essential for us to develop a sense of self and also the ability to regulate our own actions. Without this self-dialogue, the second track of language and communication, we are really left to be dependent on other people directing us or become victims of our own impulses. Now, what do we want to teach people to become effective communicators and teach children on the spectrum to become effective communicators. Let's go through a few simple principles. One is we don't want to create one style of communication for the child with autism and another style for the rest of the family. We want to create a common communication framework that works for everyone, even the most incompetent member. Secondly, we want to limit our imperative communication. You know, it's fascinating. Remember, imperative communication is the type of communication where it's always a means to an end. We're saying something because we want a very specific result. Give me that salt. Tell me 3 things. What do you call this object? What color is this? We want a specific response. When we're in an experience sharing mode, we certainly want a response, but we specifically want some uncertainty. If we know exactly what we're going to hear, we wouldn't bother to speak in the first place. You know, why bother asking what's new if we're always going to get the same response, like nothing? So we want to teach families to limit their imperative communication to 20% of their total communication. Now, this may seem very hard until you realize that 20% is about what typical people do with each other all the time. It's only when we communicate with children with autism that for some reason we begin developing this very artificial and deviant style of communication, where we're constantly prompting, questioning, and interrogating. Now, the problem with doing that, aside from the fact that it creates a real imbalance, is that human beings hate to be involved in imperative communications. When someone's constantly interrogating, prompting, and questioning us, we can't wait to get away from them. So we're actually, in many cases, teaching children that communication is aversive. The second problem is if this is what we're doing, what do we think the child is going to be modeling and using with other people? Well, we're going to be teaching this child that you should go around the world and question and interrogate and prompt everyone else around you, which again is not going to win friends and influence people, is it? So we want to emphasize the use of experience sharing communication. We want to model that and encourage it, as well as what we call self-regulating or self-dialogue. Now, we don't want to go around, you know, constantly talking to ourselves every minute of the day and night. We want to find critical places, like when we make a mistake, we're feeling a bit frustrated, we've accomplished something, where we can model the idea that there is this second stream of communication that we do with oneself. Now, if we have an emphasis just on speech without thought, we may tend to talk at a rapid pace. And we may get responses from the child, even though they're meaningless, if they learn speech. But we're not going to teach that person how to associate or connect thought and speech. What we'll get is a lot of thoughtless speech. So even though you're getting speech back, we teach our adults and our family members to slow down their pace of talk, to use fewer words, and to emphasize the importance of thoughtful speech, not just getting words out. The emphasis is quality over quantity, and making sure that someone is thinking before they respond or make a statement. The last piece that's critical is to emphasize the nonverbal aspects of communication. As I said before, we know how important the nonverbal aspects are. I want to show you 2 video segments, and they both have to do with children who have mastered the intent of communication. They may not have every skill developed, but they certainly have got the main point of why we communicate and what we do. The first are 2 teenagers, Alex and Ben, who you've seen before, playing the keyboard. They're not using multisyllabic words, but they are demonstrating qualitatively powerful communication with each other, which serves to create. In this young adult group that you're about to see, the members decided that they were going to practice conversation.